In a remarkable exercise spanning 15 years, the last survivors of the Great War were interviewed on film. These are unique stories of courage, sacrifice, and tragedy, told by the men who were there. These extraordinary interviews have been brought together for the first time. In this last film, we hear from the veterans who fought on the Western Front during 1918. Many were young conscripts rushed to the front to make up the numbers as the Germans launched a final brutal offensive. Thousands were taken prisoner and endured months of cruel treatment at the hands of their captors. It would take a final supreme effort by the Allies to win the war, and the human cost would be terrible.
For the first time I realized I may go die, and I'd never experienced anything like it before, and I was terrified. I was shaking.
Being taken prisoner was the most horrible thing I'd ever imagined could happen to me. It made me feel as if I was a coward. I was letting my country down, I was letting my battalion down, I was letting my family down. And it was a horrible, horrible feeling.
These are the last voices of World War I. On the Western Front, 1918 began with both sides recovering from the bloody war of attrition fought at Passchendaele. Although casualties had been enormous, the Allies had not made the breakthrough they had hoped for. And although by now America had joined the fighting, it would be months before her troops began to appear on the battlefields in significant numbers. In the meantime, the October Revolution in Russia brought her war with Germany to a close, and the German army now began to transport huge reserves of men and materials westwards. Now fielding more divisions than the Allies, the time had come for the Germans to launch what they hoped would be a final, brutal offensive. The German spring offensive began on the 21st of March 1918. It was a date significant to one-time shoe repairer Jack Rogers, who had been on the Western Front for nearly 3 years. It was the day of his 24th birthday, and he was busy making plans for his first leave of the war.
So I'd written to my mother and told her, please, don't send any cakes or anything else for my birthday, because I'm on the way home. I should be coming home and I should be there for my birthday, because I thought I was going on the 20th, you see. But prior to the 21st, on the 19th or 20th, all leave was cancelled, so we couldn't go.
Intelligence reports had prepared the Allies for a likely offensive, and as a trained marksman, Jack Rogers was one of those sent into the forward zone to help repel any attack.
We were sent out there at the night to occupy that trench because they were anticipating the German attack the next day. We were told to stop there at all costs. There was about, I think it was 8 of us altogether at the time then. We were in this little trench, and there we stopped. And then the morning came, and about 6 to 7 o'clock in the morning, the Germans opened up, as anticipated, the big barrage.
Dawn had brought with it a thick fog, and after a heavy artillery bombardment, elite German stormtrooper units rushed through the mist towards the Allied lines. Moving quickly, they bypassed frontline defences and instead targeted artillery positions and supply depots in the rear. Before they knew it, frontline troops like Jack Rogers found themselves outflanked and completely surrounded. After serving as a stretcher-bearer during the Battle of Passchendaele, 19-year-old Bill Easton from Norfolk was another caught by surprise at the speed and ferocity of the German attack.
They came from the back of us, you know, where our line used to be. They simply came there with loudspeakers shouting out, "Throw your arms down and we won't fire."
With Allied units at the rear in a state of confusion, the next wave of German troops moved forward, capturing trenches and the British soldiers who had little option but to surrender.
We could see Germans galore in every direction at the back of us. One came straight for me, and he got a fixed bayonet. He come rushing straight up to me, and from that moment on, I said goodbye. There was no more of me. That was the finish. I expected that bayonet to go straight into me, but it didn't. Strange enough, when he got up to me, he stopped. And the thing he said to me was, "Cigarette, comrade?" I nearly dropped to the ground with surprise. Cigarette? I thought he wanted a cigarette. So I felt in my pocket where I carried a little tin of ready-made cigarettes, and I said, "Yes." And he took some of them, he put them in his pocket, and then I put the tin back. And that was my birthday, the 21st of March, 1918.
Within just 2 days, the British Army was in full retreat and thousands were taken prisoner. The British were desperate for reserves to make up the numbers, and at home, new recruits and conscripts were told to prepare for action. With the age of frontline service now reduced, many of these new soldiers were just 18 years old. One of them was Fred Hodges, a patriotic grammar school boy from Northampton. Fred had wanted to be a soldier from the beginning of the war and volunteered for service when he was just 17.
Well, of course, every boy wanted to be in the army. Within days of the war beginning, we had 25,000 Welshmen here in the town. They were billeted in all the homes. And we had 2 nice young men, and of course I used to try their hats on and their tunics and fancy myself as a soldier. It was a natural feeling amongst boys. We thought that conscripts were men who'd been drilled and made to do things, whereas we were free. We were volunteers. We should be better soldiers than them.
Oi! You! Come here! I'm talking to you!
However, not all young men were as patriotic as Fred, and before the introduction of conscription, many had to be coerced into joining up. In towns and villages across Britain, recruiting officers scoured the streets on the lookout for likely new recruits who were cajoled or bullied into the army. 18-year-old Welsh boy Percy Williams only joined up after he was promised that it would be at least a year until he saw frontline action.
I was hoping and hoping that the war would be finished before I was called up. I had no patriotism. You may call me a bit of a coward, but I didn't want to join the army because I knew. I could see by the casualty list that so many had died.
But with the launch of the German offensive, Percy's hopes of a quick end to the war were shattered, and just months after his 18th birthday, his training was cut short and he was sent into action. As the Germans prepared for their next attack, the boys of 1918 readied themselves for the baptism of fire that awaited them. In March 1918, the German army had launched the first of a series of lightning attacks in a final bid to win the war. With their numbers boosted by the arrival of troops from the Eastern Front and the employment of new tactics, they had smashed through Allied lines, capturing ground and prisoners alike. With the Allies desperate for reinforcements, thousands of reserves had their training cut short in readiness for action. One of these was 18-year-old volunteer Fred Hodges.
On the 21st of March, the German big attack started. On the 24th, our training ceased, cut off just like that. You've been equipped for the front. The general had told us, we were inspected in a big park in Norwich. Then he got up on his dais and he said, "You men? Well, of course, I know that you're not men, you're only boys. But the Germans have broken through our fortifications and you're needed at the front at once." He said, "You've got to play the part of men." We didn't think of the danger.
Fred couldn't wait to join the action, and in his boyish enthusiasm gave little thought to the effect his leaving would have on his parents.
I put my arms around my mother, and she was crying, and she said, "If you don't come back," I don't know what she was going to say, but I interrupted that and said, "Oh, I shall come back, don't worry about that, I shall come back." And it was such an emotional moment for me that I'm afraid I broke away from her and left her, still in that fearful state.
As Fred and his colleagues boarded the trains that would take them to the coast, on the other side of the channel, thousands of Allied prisoners were beginning their journey into captivity. Jack Rogers was one of those captured on the 21st of March, the day of his 24th birthday.
And they took us for a walk till we got to a railway line. And there they forced us into these cattle trucks. We had to go into them with about 30 or 40 in a truck. They packed us all in as fast as they could till we passed, suppose we must have filled the train, for the train kept moving and it moving. And we were in that train without anything to eat or drink for about 2 days, with just this little ventilator at the top near the roof there was, where you could breathe through. Till finally we got out of a station, and that station was in Germany.
18-year-old stretcher-bearer Bill Easton was another captured on the first day of the German offensive. After marching their prisoners to a holding camp, the Germans asked for volunteers to help treat wounded British POWs held in a nearby church. Bill was the only volunteer.
And when I got in, all on the floor, right up this main aisle, whatever they call it, there were people laying on the floor. Do you know, when I counted, there was just some 40 men there. They got wounded in the shoulders, arms, and all sorts of things. I started on them. And at any rate, the next morning, the sergeant came. And he came up there, he said to me, he said, "My first mission," he said, "is to thank you on behalf of my commanding officer." He said, "And if he was here himself, he'd like to shake your hand for volunteering to do this job." And those Germans, they called me straight away Klein Englander, the little Englander.
Following the success of their first attack, the Germans now launched further offensives along the Allied lines. For the many new recruits now making up Allied numbers, including reluctant volunteer Percy Williams, the first experience of artillery bombardment was even worse than they'd expected.
All hell let loose. I'd never been under shell fire before, and I was nearly sick with fright. For the first time, I realized that I may go die. And I'd never experienced anything like it before. And I was terrified. I was shaking. And there was a gas attack before, and we had to put on our gas mask, and the gas mask got covered with a film, and you couldn't see. And then I was faint-hearted and sick, and I felt sick. So I had to take the gas off and vomit as best as I could. You see, it was fear. It was probably cowardice, but I could not help it. I'd never experienced anything so terrible in my life.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
On the 9th of April, the Germans redirected the main thrust of their offensive towards Allied defences along the River Lys. When the attack began, 18-year-old volunteer Ernie Stevens from Middlesex had been in France for just 24 hours.
And suddenly we heard this chatter of a machine gun behind us. It was obvious that the Germans had broken through and had got round to the rear of us.
As machine gun bullets rattled around them, Ernie's platoon commander realised there was no chance of escape.
And he said to me, Corporal, he said, the only thing I can suggest is, if you have a handkerchief, would you bring it out, tie it to the end of your bayonet, and indicate to the Germans that we were prepared to surrender. Being taken prisoner was the most horrible thing I'd ever imagined could happen to me. It made me feel as if I was a coward. I was letting my country down, I was letting my battalion down, I was letting my family down. And it was a horrible, horrible feeling. I've never had a feeling like it in all my life.
After being hit in the leg by shrapnel, Percy Williams was also captured.
This German came with his fixed bayonet, and I thought he was going to kill me. And I was petrified, and he said, halt, halt, halt. And they were big chaps. Oh, the Germans were big fellows. We were lads of 18, just boys. So I gave up the line of resistance. I was glad that my life had been saved. Because if I'd put up any resistance, well, you'd be bayoneted.
Further along the line, Fred Hodges was about to have his first encounter with the advancing Germans.
It was dusk, and in the front we could see the flickering and star shells going up. And then we saw a plane coming towards us, very low, could see a black outline in the darkish sky, and Corporal Hobson, a regular soldier, he said, "Don't worry, lads, it's one of ours." And then the bombs dropped, and we'd just passed an empty trench. So we turned round and scuttled back, and Corporal Hobson got a bit pushed. And he said, "I thought I brought some men up the line, not a lot of bloody scared kids." That settled us. We never showed fear again.
But the Germans soon became victims of their own success, and major tactical flaws in their battle plan appeared. By advancing too quickly, the Germans struggled to get supplies forward to support their frontline troops, who were left exhausted and exposed. And by leading the attacks with their elite stormtrooper units, the highest number of casualties suffered was amongst these highly trained, irreplaceable soldiers. These factors combined would ultimately lead to the downfall of the German advance. But in the meantime, the British prisoners captured in the spring were getting their first taste of life in captivity.
We were herded into this cage, and it seemed that every few minutes the gate was unlocked and in came another bunch. We were not given blankets or bedding, anything at all. We just had to lie on the ground and sleep as best we could. And during that time, they did not give us a drink, and they did give us maybe about 4 or 6 of their emergency rations, which were like dog biscuits. And that was only on the 3rd day. So obviously we were very, very thirsty. We'd had nothing to drink, nothing whatsoever. But it was not a fair way of dealing with unfortunate prisoners who couldn't do anything about it. And that's what you are. You're a prisoner of war. You can't do a thing. Otherwise, you might find a bullet through your head.
Not all POWs were taken immediately to prison camps. After volunteering to stay at the front to help treat wounded Allied prisoners, Bill Easton was well treated by his captors, who took a liking to the young man they called the Little Englander. In an extraordinary ceremony, Bill was made an honorary sergeant by the Germans, a moment captured in this remarkable photograph.
I was invited to a celebration for their big victory, and when I went there, there was all this company, this field ambulance, and they all shouted out Willem, because that's the nearest they get to William. And they were cheering and shouting and go ahead, and people were coming shaking hands with me. And then the Sergeant Major, he announced the fact that they were going to honour me for making me a sergeant, and that if I gave an order, their men would obey it. And that's why I was made sergeant. I was honorary sergeant. And those fellas went wild. They cheered.
But Bill's privileges weren't to last, and as the German advance began to falter, he was sent to a labour camp. He joined thousands of Allied prisoners held captive in Germany, who were forced into a routine blighted by hardship, disease and starvation. Many would never see home again. For many Allied POWs, life under their German captors revolved around periods of forced labour. In the days before the Geneva Convention, both sides had agreed to abide by a set of principles that governed the treatment of prisoners. In particular, no captured men were supposed to be used in work that assisted the enemy's war effort, but this principle was regularly flouted by both sides. 18-year-old Ernie Stevens was sent to work at this soda factory in the town of Rheinberg. Having only ever worked in an office, he found manual labour extremely hard.
It was tough. I mean, this is the kind of work that I was not used to. I'm what they commonly called in England a pen pusher. So that coming suddenly to breaking up rock or unloading a truck that filled with coal was something new to me and very hard. It's not an easy job, not by any means. Anyway, it's what we had to do. If we didn't do it, then we didn't get our meal. Not until we'd finished.
For those thought to be shirking their responsibilities, the punishment was brutal, as 18-year-old Bill Easton found to his cost.
You'd be working at a camp, and the slightest thing that had gone wrong, the guards used to get annoyed, and then you'd probably get a bang with a rifle butt, which anybody who's had it know that's very painful. you'd feel that for days, let alone anything else, because those rifles, they were shod with brass, heavy brass, and you really feel as if they were going right through you.
But being one of the youngest and weakest, Bill Easton often found that the older prisoners came to his aid, even if it meant they were on the receiving end of a beating themselves.
In the main, I was well protected by people that I was working with. They used to call me the kid sometimes. They'd say, keep your eye on the kid. And if there were signs of one of these warders approaching, they'd all get round me, and I was supposed to be wheeling barrel loads of this stuff up. Well, I couldn't push the barrel. And somehow or other, one or the other of them, he get a bang instead of me.
Despite the risk of punishment, when the guards turned their backs, many prisoners did their best to help disrupt the German war effort. Loading coal onto trucks at the soda factory, Ernie Stevens regularly did what little he could to fight back.
My duty was to do what I could to make it awkward for the Germans. I wasn't, in that sense, their friend at all. There were occasions when sentries would not be in my immediate vicinity, and I would just open the side door of the truck and let the coal out. If I could get away with it, good. And I used to look so innocent and say, oh, gee, the door must have come open. And I suppose I looked so innocent, they took my word. I don't know.
The final desperate push in the German offensive of 1918 was launched on the 15th of July. Within days, it had ground to a halt. And with the Americans now on the battlefields in numbers, the initiative returned to the Allies. On the 8th of August, the Allies attacked the Germans at Amiens. By the end of the day, the Germans had lost almost 30,000 men in what their commander, Ludendorff, called the Black Day of the German army. It was just the beginning of a rolling offensive which would last 100 days and be remembered as the most successful campaign in the history of the British Army. As the August offensive began, Fred Hodges sat alone in a trench, contemplating the wonder of life and the beauty of nature that surrounded him.
You were struck with the contrast between the horror that we men had created over 4 years and that nature was proceeding in its quiet, beautiful way. I had an eye and a feeling for it. I don't think some men noticed it. At night, you're all alone. You might be the only man in the world. And you look around and there's nothing going on. Then something comes up from the German side like this. Momentarily, you think, oh, that was. And then you notice the stars. I tried to remember what some of them were named. And then on a still day, you'd see white clouds lazily drifting over the battlefront. Larks singing above your head. And nature was going on just the same.
Back in Germany, the POWs were unaware of Allied successes at the front. The priority for most was simply finding something to eat. The British blockade of German ports had left the country short of food, and prisoners were not a high priority when it came to feeding the population. Jack Rogers had been a prisoner since March and was now suffering from severe malnutrition.
I was nearly falling to pieces. I nearly fell to pieces. Oh, I could, well, tell you the truth, you're falling through your britches, absolutely. You don't know what you're going to do. You'd almost steal anything to try and get something to eat. If you could only get a crust of bread or something like that. And I lost over 2 stone easily Might have been more, but I didn't get the chance of being weighed because of just the little light jacket and thin things I'd got on were almost falling off me, and we got in an awful state.
Although the Red Cross provided regular food parcels for those whose details had been officially registered, many prisoners simply slipped through the net or had their rations stolen by their captors.
The whole of the time I was in Germany, I never had a parcel, always hungry. And we think, oh my God, how long is this going to last? We just wanted to come out of it and get away from it. And I'd only been there a few months. Because of lack of food, I had all sores on my head. I was down from about 12 stone till about 6 or 7 stone.
As prisoners across Germany began to die from starvation and disease, back in France, Fred Hodges was developing a fascination with the dead on the battlefields.
I always went to look to see if I knew people, and we found 2 men, a German and a British, who had bayoneted one another, and this was a talking point for some time, people going over to see it. I saw a dead officer, and I picked up the corner of the ground sheet, and I thought, this is me. Your parents don't know you're dead. I had those queer thoughts that I knew what people don't know at home. He's dead.
After months in captivity, Ernie Stevens had had enough. Together with his friend Sid, he devised a plan to escape to freedom. It was a huge gamble. Failure could mean death.
We took it, I did it especially, very, very seriously. This was my life. You have to remember that, because we could easily have had a bullet in the back. Very easily.
On their next shift at the soda factory, Ernie and Sid waited for the right moment before creeping away silently to the factory perimeter.
We climbed over the wall, crossed the road and into a field. It was a very large field, and we started off across that field to where we knew there was a hedge. Then we got to the canal that we were looking for. Now, Sid, unfortunately, he got onto the pathway next to the canal, and it was stony, had a lot of pebbles. As he walked along, you could hear him a mile off. I thought to myself, well, you're doing the wrong thing. But I dare not shout out at all, because my voice would carry in that very clear night air. And sure enough, it wasn't very long after that, just a matter of seconds really, I heard a German voice shout out, "Halt, hands up." And obviously he'd walked right into a German sentry. And that was the end of freedom at the moment.
With Sid captured, Ernie decided to give himself up. They were returned to camp and punished with a period of solitary confinement, but lived to fight another day. By the end of August, the Allies had forced the Germans back to the Hindenburg Line from where they had begun their attack in the spring. As his battalion continued to advance, taking prisoners as they went, Fred Hodges became more and more confident of an Allied victory.
I felt that it was the end because we were capturing men who were not infantry, old men with long tailcoats with buttons on, cavalry probably, and boys of 16. And I took prisoners. And I was all alone. And I came to a red brick farm, which hadn't been damaged. See, where we'd come from, it was all wrecked places. So I thought, well, I'm going in here to see. I went in and I found that they'd taken refuge in there, and they put their hands up as soon as they saw me. It was an easy capture. They were thankful to be prisoners. You can tell that from their attitude.
Having prisoners in his command had a profound effect on 18-year-old Fred.
I was completely in charge. In the army, you've got men under you and you've got officers and sergeant majors over you. But the war was mine. It was my personal war that morning. That's how I felt.
By the 5th of October, the Allies had broken through the Hindenburg Line, forcing the Germans to abandon their defences and retreat. Within weeks, the Allies would be celebrating their victory and the prisoners of war their freedom. At 11 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918, the Great War finally ended in victory for the Allies. In the 4 years of fighting, more than 1 million men from Britain and the Empire were killed, and over 2 million were wounded in perhaps the most terrible war in history. As jubilant soldiers marched through liberated towns and villages, Fred Hodges reflected on just how lucky he had been to survive.
When I heard from the dispatch rider, who had got it from brigade headquarters, that the war would end at 11 a.m, my first thought was very selfish. I thought, so I'm going to live. I was stunned on belief, and at the same time a secret joy that, so I'm going to have a life. I needn't fear that I shan't survive. I have survived.
For many POWs held in Germany, the end of the war came as a complete surprise. Jack Rogers was held captive here in the town of Munster. As he and his fellow prisoners were called out on parade on the 11th of November, the camp commandant had an unexpected greeting for them, instead of the usual abuse they had come to expect.
He used to call us finance every time, never addressed us any other way. But on this particular morning, his first word he said was, "Gentlemen." He addressed us. He called us gentlemen. Well, you could just imagine the roar that went up in the air when he said, "Gentlemen." And he told us the war was over. You ought to have heard the noise. He couldn't keep us quiet. They just shouting and cheering and hooraying and all. It went on for, I think, hours nearly. We couldn't believe it. Everybody went mad. Oh, I felt like nothing on earth. I thought, what's it going to be like to be home just to see my people again, you know, to be free. Oh, I couldn't believe it.
Percy Williams was another who received the news of the armistice late. His malnutrition had become so serious, he had been transferred to a hospital in Bremen.
Well, we didn't know that we were going to be freed. We didn't know, because we were isolated. We got no newspapers, there was no radio. We couldn't believe our luck that after all this time, that the war was over and we'd go back to England. We were, of course, absolutely delighted.
The first prisoners to return to Britain were treated as heroes, and quaysides were packed with friends and relatives, waiting to welcome their loved ones home. But after months in captivity, many men, like Bill Easton, found it difficult to adjust to a life of freedom.
When I came home, I was all up in the air, to tell you the truth. I was absolutely bewildered. People say, "You're young Bill, aren't you?" And I could hardly answer them. And to tell you the truth, in the end, I got so fed up with congratulations that I didn't go out too much. I was a sort of recluse.
Ernie Stevens, who had been captured after just 24 hours in France, was another who had a traumatic homecoming.
It's very, very difficult to explain just how much that you've missed the love of your people. I know that coming home was not easy. Even though I'd been released as a prisoner of war, it was not easy at all. Because you're coming back to a new world again.
And for Ernie, that world would never be the same again. As jubilant crowds lined the streets, he returned home to the tragic news that his half-sister had died shortly before the end of the war. It was one more life lost amongst so many.
It was my stepfather that opened the door after I knocked. And he came to the door and he shouted, "Mum, it's Ernie." I'll never forget that. "Mum, it's Ernie." So Mum came out. And of course, obviously, there was hugging and kissing. And then it was a case of my mum telling me about my half-sister. Well, she told me that I should never see Gladys again because she had died of the flu and was buried on Armistice Day afternoon. As you can tell, it still hurts.
The Great War, one of the most catastrophic wars in human history, will very soon be beyond living memory. All of those interviewed for this series have since passed away. But in recording their experiences on film, it is hoped that their stories will live on, ensuring that their sacrifice and the sacrifice of millions like them will never be forgotten. The final words on the horrors of the war belong to them, beginning with Harry Patch, the last veteran to have served in the trenches. These are the last voices of the Great War.
Why have we lost millions of men and the Germans and all other people that was in that war? Why have we done that and then settled it round the damn table? Why couldn't they do that at first and save all those lives?
Oh no, we didn't think it was in vain, but I wouldn't volunteer again to do it. They'd have to call me up and do something, I don't know. We thought it was going to be a lovely little game, you know, but it wasn't. It was wicked. Wicked.
We all had great fun, really. Tremendous fun. Enjoyed ourselves. I personally enjoyed the Ruddy War, I think. I don't know why, but it was great fun.
Like me, you get sat by yourself, you know. Things goes through your mind, you think. And then, well, why did I join it? Well, all this for any purpose. And I still think it was for no bloody purpose.
Well, it was all wrong, wasn't it? We shouldn't have been in it in the first place. soldiering. I like soldiering, but I wasn't in the act really with it. No, it was all wrong.
I was happy. I knew I did something for my country. I felt happy, and I still feel happy. But yes, I still feel very happy that I was in that war and that came out. Because as we say, if it hadn't been for us, a lot of people wouldn't be here today. And I still maintain that. Some of those fellows gave their lives so that other people could live. And I still contend that they saved us all, they saved the country.